Hey there, Sean here, one of the hosts of Software Huddle, and we have a special treat for you today. Alex and I were recently in Miami at the Infobip Shift Developer Conference doing on-site interviews, and this is the first one in that series. If you're watching the video version of this, things are going to look a little bit different than our usual setup since we recorded these actually in person with the guests. And first up is Ivan Burazin, the co-founder and CEO of Daytona, an actual creator of the Shift Developer Conference that he sold some time ago to Infobip. I've known Ivan for years. He's a super smart guy, has tons of experience building developer tools, has been working on dev environments for over a decade. In this interview, we talk about another company he founded called CodeAnywhere that eventually led to the founding of Daytona. Daytona is a dev environment management platform. It's just between your IDE and the cloud, taking care of standardizing your dev environments, regardless of whether you're building on your desktop or deploying to production. They're taking the best of what leading technology companies like Google, Uber, and Meta have built internally and bringing that to the rest of the world. I love talking to Ivan, so I think you'll enjoy this interview. We'll have a few more like this coming from the event. If you ever have questions or suggestions for the show, feel free to reach out to me or Alex. And thanks for listening, and over to the show. Ivan, welcome to Software Huddle.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, awesome. So we're here at the Infobip Shift conference in Miami, which is a conference that you actually started, and now you're here as a participant, speaker. So I guess, does it feel weird to be the person who's created the conference, originally organized it, and now you're kind of just here, you've handed it off, you're not actually doing it anymore?
I feel that, so this is the second conference in the series. So the main one is in Europe on the Mediterranean. Much bigger, you've been there a couple of times.
Yeah.
And so going to that one last year was weirder than this one. This is like a new foray into the US, it's much smaller. And so it's also quite similar to last time. So it is kind of odd, but I have to say that one, which has been going on for 12 years, that one's more sort of hits home and sort of an
you probably have a ton of memories.
Yeah,
exactly.
Painful ones.
Yeah. Well, at least now you probably don't have all the anxiety.
None.
Yeah.
Absolutely none. Now I'm a speaker. That's it.
And you can make fun of them when things don't go right. Yeah. So I want to talk about Daytona, your new company, but I think it also would be useful to give some sort of history and context for some of the stuff you did in the past, because I know Daytona is doing things beyond what you were doing at your other company, CodeAnywhere, but I think there is some relevant history from that experience. So can you talk a little bit about CodeAnywhere and the original project of PHP Anywhere, and where is that project now?
Yeah, sure. So definitely planted the seed and the reason Daytona exists. If there was no CodeAnywhere, originally, if there was no CodeAnywhere, there would be no Daytona, basically. And so it started in 2009 for some of the people that might be listening, might be very early, but have not existed. So this is pre-Web 2.0, this is Web 1.0. And so my co-founder, Vedran, the company I owned then bank was a client and he was a CIO, and he was working on hacking through this idea about creating a browser-based editor. It was a text editor with an FTP connector, as you did things in 2009.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, this is awesome. We have to start a company, screw everything we're doing. We're going to do this. And he said, you're an idiot. I'm like, no, seriously. I've read it on TechCrunch. TechCrunch was there at that point. But it was still, TechCrunch was a side project for Mark Arrington, was his name. So it wasn't the full thing yet. Even TechCrunch wasn't successful. And he's like, fine, here's half of whatever this is. And let's good, make something of this. And that was sort of where we kicked off of creating a cloud-based IDE. So we originally called it PHP Anywhere, or Vedran did, because he was a PHP developer, and the idea was...
Well, it was 2009. What were your options?
Yeah, ASP.NET. ASP, not even .NET.
Yeah, not even .NET.
And so that was it. And so PHP Anywhere was born. And so we worked on that as a side project. You couldn't do anything. There was no Web 2.0. You couldn't do syntax highlighting. We actually tried to do it I was pretty proficient in Flash then in ActionScript.
Oh yeah.
So I was going to try, we're trying to build this out in ActionScript, a syntax highlighting. Likely we didn't get it very far. Ajax came up, which was, all the stuff that you do on the client side. And we were able to create a syntax highlighting in your browser. And so when the technology was there, we actually said, okay, let's do this full time, and we rebranded it to CodeAnywhere. I sold my previous services company. He left the bank, and we started doing that. And so the idea was similar to now that developers can just click a button, everything automatically works. At this time, Google Docs became a thing. Everything went to the browser. It's like, oh, why doesn't software development come there? Little did we know that no, it's not going that way. But anyway, it became somewhat successful. I think like almost 2.5 million people signed up. There was a bit of investment in the product as well. At one, we worked on it till 2016, 17, I want to say, really hard. And it basically got to a revenue point that it could not expand from. The users were individual users. There was no enterprise expansion. Like, because you were constrained by a browser-based editor to access this dev environment, it was very hard for developers in a enterprise setting to want to adopt it.
Yeah.
And also for companies to buy it, because it was very much, a SaaS type product. So there's no security compliance, run it behind your firewall type thing. Anyway, we didn't even know how to do that. Anyway, we ended up at one point saying, oh, this is not going very far. We paid back all the investors, and basically one person was left running it, and we went off to do other things. Hence, Shift was born. We did Shift. And so sold Shift, fast forwarding, sold Shift, or Infobip acquired it and ran their developer experience department for a couple of years. But what's interesting, about 16 months ago, 18 months ago, whatever, time goes super fast, we started getting pull from the market about development environment. So your analysts, Gartner, Forrester, IDC, Redmonk, CB Insights, they wanted to be briefed about this thing. They didn't have the correct name, but they were interested. We actually got people calling us, so we were interested in that. Then we had some ideas. We started poking around again, like with technical solutions for what people are asking for. We got some interesting flagship design partners, which are customers now. Can't say them yet, but like super well-known companies, not tech companies, but like they've been around for a long, long time. And like, oh, okay, these big companies are interested in this. And we also got acquirers, so like people wanted to like buy whatever we had at that point.
Right, yeah.
So we could have actually sold it in January of last year, the thing that was there.
Yeah.
And so it was like a small, but it was like single-digit million thing. We could have like sold that. And we discussed, so me, Vedran, and Goran, who's the third co-founder and was the person managing CodeAnywhere. And the two of them, actually, I was actually okay to sell it. And they were like, because like, we did this once, gonna do it again, really? And they're like, no, we're not doing this. Like, they wanted quite a bit more. And like, no, we're not doing this. I'm like, okay, if we're not doing this, then we're actually doing this as a company again. Like, we did a bunch of research as well, so it wasn't a flim of the, like when we did PHP Anywhere or CodeAnywhere, it was basically like, we're talking now. At the end of the conversation, I was like 50% owner of this thing. Like, done, I had no market research, right? While this sort of happened from 18 months ago, 6 months in, like we were building this, we did our research, we found that like tech companies, Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, Shopify, Intuit, Eventbrite, like all these tech companies have built something internally because of this huge pain point. The problem sort of also starts happening above 50, you start feeling it. Over 100, you certainly feel it on the engineering side of the efficiency of developers, the satisfaction, and also, of course, the DevOps or platform engineering team has to help solve all of these problems. So, this is a big issue here. Security, as I mentioned in the talk, like a lot of companies are using terminal services to solve these development environments remotely. Yeah. It's like, okay, there seems to be pull from the market. People want to buy it as customers. People want to purchase it as acquirers. Analysts are interested, and there seems to be a market problem, and we know who the ICP is now. It's like, oh, okay, I didn't even know what ICP was the first time. So it's like, okay, we're doing this. Yeah. And so I quit my job at Infobip. Actually, I gave my notice on Shift last year. Yeah. So that was fun. I left some stock on the table as well, but I think it was a big enough sort of thing to pursue. And so, sorry, went a little long on that story, but that's how we came to
Anyway, so you're saying a lot of companies are building their own internal in-browser editors?
So let's define it, not the in-browser editor. So that's the part of CodeAnywhere that's the least important. Yeah. What's important is with the in-browser editor, you still had a development environment that you, essentially like a container that you had to spin up for the person. Yeah. And so that container that was spun up and orchestrated, that service is what these companies are very much interested in. So
browser-based, some sort of like easy dev prod parity that I can have locally.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's very much, this is very much an infra tool. Yeah. So we spin up and manage all the infra for the dev environment versus what you have right now for your prod. Yeah. It's very similar, but you in dev basically have those same issues, except for the scale in the sense of the amount of hits you have on the product. Everything else is identical.
Yeah.
And then for CodeAnywhere, do you think that, why maybe you were able to have it like take off the same way was it like just too early, or were you kind of maybe attacking the problem sort of the wrong interpretation of the problem, because you're focused on sort of like you said, like the least important part, which is the in-browser editor, but like really what people value is this like dev environment.
For sure, I think we did everything wrong. Everything. So one thing, we didn't understand. So again, when I get to ICP, so when we look at Daytona now, the user is the developer, but the buyer is not the developer. The buyer is the engineering manager, platform engineering manager, CISO sometimes for security, but the developer is just the user.
Right.
And I say just in the sense of not that they're least important, but they're not the one that are going to make the transaction. Yeah. So that's why when we did, and I'm getting ahead of myself, when we decided to do something open source, we open sourced everything of value to the developer, because there's no monetary value in that. Everything that's valuable to the engineering manager or CISO, that is what's charged for. But you as a developer don't care about that. Like that, you're not missing that in the open source part anyway. So on one hand, we didn't understand who we were trying to sell to the developer.
Right.
Wrong.
Yeah.
Wrong.
That's a tough monetization strategy.
Not doing that. The other thing is we were early, so there's a lot of things that were not unlocked. So IDEs, so JetBrains and VS Code now support, or over the last 2 years, support remote dev environments as if they were local. That didn't exist. So you had to either use terminal services or a browser. There was no other way to do that. Also, remote development was not that much of a thing. Now, like 50% of developers work remotely, either because of, large language models they're trying to train, data locality, like they have to be close to a data source. So like if you have a large bunch of data, by the time the data gets to your laptop, that just like takes a bunch of time. You'd rather have the environment like in the same data center so it travels really fast. Or again, security or geolocation. So I have to run it. I'm a EU company, have to be in the EU, or I'm the Department of Defense of the US. It has to run like in this very specific place, right? Yeah. So yeah.
Like what like you talked about how like if you're a 50-person organization, you kind of like start to feel the pain. Hundreds, like what is that pain? Like what is the problem that like these remote dev environments actually like solve for companies?
So I just want to say like it's not just remote dev, but like the automation of all dev environments, so both local and remote. So what Daytona does, and I talked this a bit in the call, is that we very much were inspired by Shopify. The way they started is that before a laptop would get to the engineer, the team that was managing dev environments actually installed everything that you need on your laptop. So then when you got it, you could just get off to the race and start working. And so they had a whole team that would help you spin up and manage these local dev environments. And then at one point they said, oh, like the laptop is too small for these projects that we're working on. We have to create a remote development environment. And then they started from scratch and then noticed they were doing the same thing twice. And so they created this one experience that allows the developer to create a dev environment, completely automated, and it always works, local or remote, depending on use case, size, whatever. Like, because if you're doing a front-end marketing landing page, there's no point in spinning up a meter on AWS, or you don't need anything. And you always have like a fraction of a lag in the terminal because it's not on your local host. And so why would you not run that local? There's no security issues, like why not? But you still don't want to have a different way of work than you're working when you're doing remotely. So I digressed the question. I forgot what it was.
Basically, what problem is like the remote dev environment solving for these different companies?
Oh, sure. So that's what I was going to get to. Is that so? The problem. There's a couple problems, and different companies have different ways they weight these problems. So I'll take the easiest one, which is the productivity of the developer. Whereas like developers spend half their time wasted on either troubleshooting or managing the dev environment itself. And if the three of us are in a startup, like if I have an issue, like you'll come to my laptop and you'll help me fix that. And so as you add people, that becomes more and more complex and harder to do. So you're a 1,000-person organization, and now you have a new engineer. It takes them on average 2 weeks to get their first code deployed, right? Versus if there's the three of us, we'll get it the first day. And so how do we get it back to that first day? The other thing is that developers in these large organizations, and especially non-tech, or like what I call tech is, the Ubers, Googles, Shopify's of the world. So we're talking, I'm not trying to pick on names, but banks, insurance, whatever.
Not necessarily engineering first.
Yeah, not engineering, but they still have 10,000 engineers.
Yeah.
And so in these organizations, a lot of them don't even use Docker locally, right? There's a level of sophistication that comes with these tech companies that is not trickled down to these large enterprises. And so there's a larger burden for these teams to get to that same level. And so with the automation of this, they get, without having to learn, teach, or have anyone help them out, they get the same level of automation and the same type of development environment that you do in these.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're sort of like steeped in the tech world, like the three of us, you generally make assumptions about like where the rest of the world is in terms of like, everybody's on the cloud, but the reality is only like 20% of businesses are on the cloud, or everybody's using this like modern stack and stuff, and it's just not.
They're not. Yeah.
And like when last year I was at a conference about APIs, and I saw a large bank in Europe that was presenting, and their big like innovation investment that they made in the last year was they're now running on APIs, and it's like, well, good for you, but like that's like not necessarily new news, but that's like the reality of many businesses. So how can you help shorten the gap essentially from what Google or something like that is doing versus like a bank or maybe some other type of
actually, and some of the conversations we're having is also for the ones that are trying to modernize their dev environments. Like they don't use containers, microservices, like nothing. It's like even a service like, I'm not saying Daytona, but even a service like Daytona helps them sort of get a step into that, because they don't have to think about that part of it. They can still work with the same stack that they're doing, but now we sort of take care of the quote unquote packaging of that dev environment for them. Mm-hmm. So it is not, cloud native as it should for real, but it is sort of getting them into that way of work.
Where do tools like code spaces and stuff like that not like live up to this expectation of some of these companies? Like, I know that like the tagline I think you guys have is like code spaces for the enterprise or something like that.
That was our first tagline for the enterprise product, and we're trying. It still rings true. So basically, there was I forgot who the quote was. It was like Mark Benioff or someone else. It's like, what happens if Google comes into your market? Well, then you've succeeded, right? Because then there's someone that wanted to. Then there's a proof point that the market exists. Yeah. And so Codespaces was something that was missing when we were doing CodeAnywhere. Like if that had happened, probably there would have been a bigger sort of jump. Codespaces does a really good job of being integrated inside of GitHub. And if you use github.com, there's one button and it'll spin up the dev environment for you. It's an amazing experience, and we very much look to that, what they did. But there's a couple of fundamental problems with that. One is it only works on github.com. Mm-hmm. So not GitHub Enterprise, not Bitbucket, not GitLab on-prem, not
right. Yeah. So you're basically vendor locked into that.
Not even the vendors. Like even if you have GitHub Enterprise, you can't on-prem. If you have a GitHub Enterprise on-prem, you can't use it at all. Mm-hmm. So that leaves you. That's 74% of the market cannot use it. I'm not saying like if everyone wanted to use it using github.com, still 74% of the market can't use it. So that's one. The other thing is that it is inefficient from a cost perspective, because they basically charge you for a full VM for each developer, which you might not want to do. When you're a developer writing code, you're writing it in your IDE. You're not using 32 gigs or 64 gigs. You're essentially just using it when you're running the code, not when you're typing the code, right? Yeah. So that is a huge, for them it's great. It sells Azure, right? So that's there. But also it is, from a security perspective, it's also just a SaaS. So not just security, but it's a SaaS. So a lot of companies can't use it. The companies we're talking to, enterprise, they all want to run it on their infra, be it their cloud, their air-gapped cloud, or their completely on-prem. Yeah. But also, not even that, if you're a large company, you usually have credits that you have to use or contractual spend of cloud. So a couple companies I know, they have like 10, 15, $20 million a year that they have to spend. And so if I have to spend that and it's hard for me to spend it, like why would I spend another, 100, 200, 500,000 in code spaces versus when I can have a service like Daytona or someone else have that same experience, but I'll retire credits that I have to retire anyway. So those are a couple of reasons why I feel that Codespaces isn't quite there, but they have been sort of a spearhead in the headspace of developers that this is actually an okay thing to do.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, they've helped like create the market. And
Absolutely, yeah, that's the exact point. So it's great, you've created the market, and now when we come, it's like, we're not idiots. It's like, which people have told us before. It's like, oh yeah, that's totally cool, but I can't use it for whatever reason. It's like, yes, you can, here you go. So.
What does that look like to onboard a new customer comes in, they have all these applications. What does that look like to get started with Daytona so that they can push these remote environments?
So there's a installation script, basically a Terraform script that they can install on their infra. They should get it up. We had a POC yesterday. They were super fast. They got it up in 1 day. Yeah. Awesome. We've had some people that takes like a week or two. Our team takes an hour, but to each his own. Yeah. So they get it up and running. The developer essentially can mid-project just check out the repo that they've been working on and start working. So for the developer, there's essentially, I like to say, almost zero transition cost. There is, in the sense of your mind has to be like, oh, now I have to write this command Daytona create versus whatever I was doing up until now. But it's very, very little. It's as small as can be transition from what they were doing now to using a Daytona type service.
And am I tearing down the environment like every night when I log off, or like am I keeping up my environment? Or what?
So the thesis is that they're ephemeral, so that they basically die. The admin product by default, you can change these defaults. Like if you're not working on it for half an hour, it'll just go to sleep, not to waste resources. And if you don't use it for 2 weeks, it'll kill it. But you can change that. Some companies want them long-lived, so some companies essentially have their laptop in the cloud. So it's just like one, and it stays there forever, which is an option that you can do as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned sort of like, you open source the developer parts, but you've kept, the other parts. What is that delineation? Like, what are those different components?
Sure. So it took us a while to figure this out. So we started with an enterprise product first, and we really wanted to create an open source product. Competitive companies have open source products, but what they did, and this is what my CTO was very adamant that he didn't want to do, is they open source the entire enterprise product. And so when you look, that is valuable in the sense like security and compliance people can take a look at the code. We probably will source available our enterprise as well just for that reason. Yeah. But you're not actually helping the open source community, because if your problem as an individual is I want to check out this repository and just like do a few commits, make sure it works, then I'm not going to spin up a cluster to do this. Like, it is an oxymoron. Like, it's harder than what you have right now. And so we're like, okay, so how do we make something that an individual developer, that will help the individual developer? And so we did look at the way GitLab did open core, because fundamentally we are open core. But what they did, and we did a different way, we'll see if that ends up being a pain for us, is that they have one repository, and then you have different licenses in different folders, essentially, right? So when you check out GitLab, there's an MIT part and there's a proprietary part, but you get the whole thing, which is just, if I'm trying to contribute, if you're trying to contribute to the source code, it's just more confusing or complex for you. So what we did is actually, Daytona has on the top level sort of like a control plane where it has all the security features, audit logs, RBAC, SSO, whatever. The value there is for the security. Yeah. Underneath that is the orchestration of multiple development environments. So like hundreds of thousands of dev environments are spun up and down every time, different sizes, different locations, whatever. And that helps the DevOps team or platform engineering team or whatever. It takes a load off their plate, right? And then inside of each of those dev environments is what we call the developer experience, what I demoed partially on the talk, which is just one click. It spins it up, it executes all the code, it connects to your VS Code locally or JetBrains, it adds reverse proxy, all these things that you sort of interact with the developer. And we sort of pulled that out and finished it and created its own sort of product out of that. And what we created is a really, really small repository, and we also compiled it into a single binary. So you download it, you run it, and it just works. That's it. There's no complication. And we had contributors, we open sourced it like a month ago, like we had a contributor 30 minutes in.
Wow, yeah.
Because it's like, I assume it's a good problem, probably did an okay project, but also that it's really simple to figure out what you need to do there. So you as a developer, like, oh, this makes my life easier. What we essentially gave is like a CodeSpaces SaaS-like experience, and it runs locally on your machine. It also runs remotely, obviously, but you get a SaaS experience on your local machine, which we think is very unique to the market.
So once a customer gets like their dev environment defined through you said like Terraform or something like that, right?
Terraform is the orchestration of the enterprise product. The dev environment, we use Kubernetes as an orchestrator, and you get a micro VM as a dev environment. So,
Okay.
yeah.
And so, sorry, like, so if does that mean I have to be like running on Kubernetes and I'm just like run these pods?
No. So the enterprise product. So you as a developer, you don't know what's on Kubernetes.
Yeah.
You don't know that.
Yeah.
The platform team does, but you don't.
Okay.
So, and also inside the dev environment, you can spin another Kubernetes if you want to.
Okay.
Work on it.
Yeah. So if I have like, let's just say like a Ruby on Rails app and it needs a MySQL server, someone on my platform team is going to like configure what this app looks like and all that stuff. And then I, as a developer, I just run Daytona up. And
Yeah, so if you have if they configured like a Docker Compose with all that in there, you check out a repository with that inside of it, and Daytona will spin that all for you, yeah.
And then, so once I have that set up, then essentially how does the IDE connection? Is I know JetBrains, VS Code, a lot of these support out of the box connections to dev environments. Is that now sort of standard for all IDEs, and is that essentially the workflow that you're seing developers use, or are there other configurations that they have to do?
No, they don't do any. We take care of them for them, and that very much is the way we work. Like even if you're working today on your local machine with a Docker container, VS Code is essentially working remotely. You can see that it's a remote connection, even though it's on your machine, but it's a remote connection, and that same standard is used for these development environments as well. So the only difference is that it's not physically running on the hardware that you're using right there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then in terms of some of the companies that had done this originally, like Google, Uber, I think Meta, all these big tech companies have essentially separately solved this problem. Yeah. What is do you know what they're doing there? Are their engineers working on are they using essentially native IDEs running on their machines, or are they using some in-browser coding experience or some combination?
As far as I know, almost all of them are using VS Code, in that sense, to get it up and running. I'm not sure what Google. I think Google has their own thing. They're very specific.
Well, they have Cider, which is their in-browser, but from my experience most people are actually using IntelliJ if they're Java, and then that is connected to the remote developer environment. And Cider is more for hey, I don't have access to IntelliJ and I need to make a...
Also, I think the IntelliJ is also streamed the way they do it or something like that. So if they have Chromebooks and it's streamed, and they make it work really well, and they're very specific. But what's interesting, so I talked to one of the persons at Uber, one of the people at Uber that did it, and they actually made everything work through VS Code. Even the mobile apps, they code through VS Code. So they've made it work in that way. And everyone that I've introduced, so I've interviewed half the people that have created this type of product internally, and almost everyone uses VS Code or JetBrains.
Okay.
And so that's how they're working.
Yeah, how does mobile development work with Daytona?
Not really.
It doesn't?
Not really,
yeah.
no. So there's a lot of things TBD for that. So one is we only support dev environments that are Linux-based currently.
Yeah.
So that's something we're working on right now, where you can have any basically machine. So it could be a Windows machine, a Mac machine, whatever. So you'll be able to do that as well. But mobile is definitely not the best way to do it. And I remember talking to the person over at Uber. It was a very complex setup for them. So they have the Mac machines remotely, but they also had a farm of iPhones, and then connected to that originally, and then they did a lot of magic to make that remote dev environment for a actual iOS mobile phone work. I think where we are in the market and where the market is right now, the benefit of us trying to create such a thing is sort of still on the edges. So we're still going to focus on the majority of where things are.
Yeah, sure. I mean, what about offline?
So offline, yes, offline works. So and this is a security feature. So because we've created very uniquely this ability to run a development environment both locally and remotely, if security allows you to, you can have that dev environment, you can check it out locally and have that same experience and just continue working on an airplane or whatever it may be. And of course, if you have the size of the machine that it can fit. Otherwise, there's no way to work offline. I also don't think it's that much of a problem. Nothing works offline anymore. So there is that argument, it doesn't work on an airplane, but I can't do anything if I don't have internet on my airplane. So like if I have it, I do. Like I don't have email, I don't have anything. Yeah. But yeah, I have internet on most airplanes now. So
for sure. And then what's like the deployment model? So is there like for running like Daytona, am I running that within my cloud environment?
You're running it on your infra, whatever you want it to be. So GCP, AWS, it could be Hetzner, it could be whatever. It could be actual. We have a client that has actual like HP servers in their data center, and we're installing that. So we're very agnostic to where you want it to be run.
Will you run it ever on your own infra, or are you just like, hey, it just makes sense?
For now, it's not in the roadmap. I think it's we do it just from a go-to-market perspective. We feel that their code spaces and other competitors are competing on the SaaS part of it. And so it's very crowded. But also I think that's where the lowest amount of value is, because there you have the single developer where we've given an open source equal to that. And you have the SMBs, which essentially don't feel that problem that much. So our thesis now is that there's a huge overhead of both cost and management and services to create a SaaS. There's a lot of competitors in that space, and the return on investment is still very low. So we're staying away for that for the time being.
And then since you're going after like this problem, I mean, not necessarily, it doesn't have to be true enterprise if you're like, if you're starting to feel this pain acutely with 100 engineers, but it's a decent sized organization. Are there, specific product investments that you end up having to make, probably like from security perspective, privacy perspective, like what are some of those decisions that you had to do in order to be able to sell into those kind of companies?
Sure. I mean, the product is, we don't call it a V1. It'll be V1 fairly soon, but it is deployed, in production for a lot of customers. But one thing that we've found consistently is that these real, as you call them, real enterprise, large ones, they have a lot of table stakes features that are basically security and compliance features. Yeah. So they have nothing to do with the product experience, whatever. That is all like there. And I have to say, like, our plan on like the R&D roadmap for the next year is, on one hand, the open source and getting that like experience better. The other hand is just like security features, just like a bunch of them, like an enormous amount of them. So yeah, so there's customers that we can deploy to like right away, works right away. There's customers that are like, oh, you do need, X or Y or Z. And then it's like, do you need it tomorrow? When do you plan? The good thing is, or the lucky thing with these very, very large enterprises, they're never buying today for today. They're buying today for like 2 quarters out.
Right, they're buying your roadmap.
Yeah, and so that's totally fine. And that gives us time. Okay, we have to prioritize these features because, and the interesting thing, it's usually not specific to that customer. You'll have 3 customers later on that'll ask for the same thing. And you have experience in this, I'm sure, as well, yeah.
Was that a new area for you, like selling to the enterprise and figuring out how that worked? Like, what was that like learning that?
Very new, yeah. It's like, oh, we have this product, like just go install it, it works. They're like, oh, first, here's like this stack of paper. Yeah. Like, please fill all of these things out. Like, what is this? Oh, this is like who you are, all these things. Like, what is your entire processes? Are you certified against all these things? The neat thing that we figured out is that when we don't manage the service, and the majority don't want us even to manage it, like they want that we have zero access, then a lot of the compliance requirements are just like not applicable.
Interesting.
Which makes it so much easier for a small startup.
Yeah, because you're not even the data processor in this.
Yeah, we have no data access at all. So then you don't have, it's a nice to have, like all these certification things, but it doesn't really matter. It's not a no-go. You're not compliant. You're not applicable, which is great. Yeah. So you have a smaller subset of features that you have to be compliant against, and you just like focus on those.
Yeah.
But your go-to-market is also going to be substantially different. Like today, are you mostly doing like founder-led sales in order to get into these companies?
Yeah, it is mostly inbound and then founder-led. I start taking that. Yeah, so that's basically it. So we have a go-to-market which has been basically just creating content, which is created about 50 leads a month. Mm-hmm. Then we launched the open source, which is like skyrocketed to like 50 leads a week. Inbound, and like the quality of the leads are all over the place. But you have this like inbound constantly of people coming in. And now we're adding obviously BDRs and sort of getting that sort of sales motion.
Yeah, they're like, proper sales.
Proper sales.
Yeah, exactly. And then like with the open source, I think like one of the big values of open source, besides it being potentially like a lead generator, is it's great for creating like fast feedback cycles. So you can, like if you only have 10 customers, like there's only so much feedback you can get. Whereas open source, you get a lot of feedback, but it can also drown you.
Yeah.
And I guess like how do you balance sort of like listening to the community, investments that you're making to the open source product, while also like, hey, like we're a company, we need to pay the bills, and we have people who are like real clients that are signing checks, and balance the requirements that they have.
So I have to say, like, that has been the launch of the open source and getting that inbound and a bunch of like issues and PRs has been like a accelerant in the company. So Toma, one of our engineers, which you've met, like the excitement, the amount of work they push out now. So they push out 2 releases a week now on the open source product project. And that was the excitement was basically what you said, the feedback loop, because the feedback we have a handful of enterprise customers. And so the other ones that are coming in is like, oh, you have a call, then you have another call, then you have a demo, then you have a POC. Then by the time it gets to the actual engineer using it, like you're talking about like 9 months later.
Yeah.
And then you just get a fraction of the feedback because it goes through multiple hoops to get to you. But when you're in the open, like out in the open, it's like every day, which has actually been, for us, it's been absolutely great. Like there has been nothing bad in the sense of detrimental, like you guys are off course, whatever. Like there's things that don't work, which is fine, bugs. But like generally it's been really, really positive and energizing for the team. And so how do we split time between the two, or roadmap? So one thing we tried to describe on our README and our contributing is that this is our roadmap. Our roadmap is public. And the roadmap serves the product, which serves the company. Hopefully we created this open source because we think it's a problem and you all shouldn't have this problem. Like, I want you this problem to be done in the world.
Yeah.
You type Daytona create, that's it, start working. So the way we wrote it is like, if you want to contribute, like here are the things on the roadmap. If you want to take one of those, feel free. If you want to add something that's not in the roadmap, like let us know. We'll obviously accept things that are not on a roadmap that don't take us off course. So the interesting thing is like, we have support for every Git provider, like even Git. I didn't know that was a thing. They have like 25,000 stars on GitHub or whatever. So GITEA. And like we support that now in the open source. Like that doesn't take away from our main course. And if it's in there, like fine, I'm totally okay with that. We have users that want to use that. Great. So those types of things. And so we try to be very transparent. It's like, if you want to work on the projects that are like on the roadmap, by all means, go ahead. If you don't want to do those, you have some other ideas, like let us know. But there's also a third option, which we're launching. We hinted to it. We're also launching a plugin system as well. So like if you want to build something for you, like build it as a plugin so it doesn't take away from you.
Right, yeah. If you need something specific for your company or project or whatever, right? Yeah, you can build it.
So that's how we're thinking about that.
And then you mentioned earlier that you did like everything wrong at CodeAnywhere. And I have like deepest empathy for also, I feel like with my first company, I did everything, especially the first year, absolutely everything wrong that you could do. All the cliches, we did all those things. So given that this is like your second time around, like what are there specific lessons that you learned from that experience at CodeAnywhere that now from the mistakes that you made that you're not making at Daytona, or like what are some of the things that you've done strategically in the basically year or so since you've really been doing this full time that are different?
A couple of things. One is for sure the first thing I mentioned is actually doing your research and figuring out, does it make sense, or like are you crazy or not? Like, do you know what you're doing? Is there a market? I also learned that from Shift. Is like, is there a market for what you're doing? So the first Shift was actually a startup conference, and it lost money for 3 years. Because there was in Eastern Europe, there was no one interested in paying for sponsorship or tickets for creating an entrepreneurial conference. I ended up switching it to a dev conference because of CodeAnywhere. And then I'm like, figured out, oh, there's developers that actually have salaries, not poor founders, which I was one of them, that can pay tickets, and sponsors want to sponsor this thing. Like, oh, cool. Okay, I get this now. And then I did multiple events, different cities, different things, and sort of figured it out. Same thing like, Daytona, I was like, oh, this is the buyer, this is the market, this is their budget. It's like, obviously these things can be wrong, but there's like a thesis behind it. Like there's some data points that you have. That's the first thing. Other thing, like definitely like people-wise, I'm very much more through the multiple companies that I've had. Like you want to, and we talked about this last night as well. It's like you want to hire 2 more people because you want to move fast because you're like breaking. But also, if you don't hire the people that fit or they're not at, they don't have to be necessarily like lower quality, but like the quality or the place that they're coming from doesn't produce high quality in the environment of a startup, then that you're basically taking a discount of the stuff that you can get done. But the worst part is as you add more people, then that hurts even more. So you get a lower quality of output in general. And so that's something I've been like for sure tinkering with. The other thing is very much, this sounds like a cliche, but adaptability, which I learned because of COVID for sure. So when it hit, this also started the conference, like we were at the largest point ever investing in new conferences. And then the pandemic came and we almost like went bankrupt. And so we could have died. A lot of them did die, but we basically pivoted to virtual conferences, as did everyone. But I'm not saying we did it first, we did it like 2 weeks after the pandemic.
Yeah.
So basically now also when we're building Daytona, it's like, we had a couple of theses. Like we were first thinking of doing a SaaS, then we figured out, oh, it's only on-prem. Okay, no SaaS, like delete that. There's excess work in the code base that enables us to spin up Daytona as a SaaS right now. It's like, doesn't matter, we're not doing it because of this, okay, we're switching to this. Okay, these are where the customers are, this is what we're doing. Open source, like, what are we doing? Like, we didn't do it until we found that like, this helps the market, this does this. And so, not sure how to explain that to someone, but like, be very open that you should have a plan, but that plan will probably change.
Yeah.
And so then quickly adapt to that, because that can create leaps and bounds of difference than had you stayed on your original trajectory.
Yeah, I found from being part of like multiple startups, like that kind of like resilience to change and being okay with like, hey, I just invested like, 2 quarters in this project that we decided to like throw away because it didn't make sense strategically for whatever reason. Like that's not a comfortable place for many people to live in, but so you need to have like personality match to not only skill match to be successful, I think, in a startup.
I think that's a problem of like people in general. Like how many times have you heard like, I put so much time in this, I'm not giving up now. It's like, maybe you should. Again, sometimes it's hard to know because sometimes the one that pushes through is the one that actually like succeeds. But sometimes like this thing doesn't really make sense.
Yeah, because you hear so many stories about like, the company that struggled for 8 years and then was big. So it's like, I think as a founder, you're constantly balancing like, am I like just on the edge of like breaking through, or should I like give up and do something new? And to that point, like how did you think through sort of with CodeAnywhere? Like you actually had something that, was generating money, you had people that were engaging and using it, and then you had to kind of walk away from that to go do like something new that's hopefully bigger. How did you think through that choice?
It was really hard. Yeah. That was really hard. And it was interesting, like one of a VC I was talking to like 2-3 weeks ago, like very deep in dev tools, might even be listening. He's explaining like, you guys did this and you were just on the cusp of it. You were just like, you were right there and you didn't get it. Like just, I digress, there's a company called Replit, which is essentially, it's worth $1 billion. 10 years later. So maybe we could have been like, if we just add a bit more, but also there's something of like, the pace at what you're doing, like our pace wasn't there anymore. Like, 10 years in or 5-6 years full time, like you didn't have that pace anymore. So we had to pull the trigger in the sense we never killed it, which maybe we could have, maybe that would have been a stronger thing, but then Daytona wouldn't have existed. So it's a weird thing, but it's like, whatever we do, the way we thought about it is like the growth graph, whatever levers we pulled, it was like a ceiling. We couldn't get.
Yeah.
There was nothing to be done. And it's like, we tried like, promo codes and, conferences and reaching out and doing all these different things and, lowering prices and hiring prices and no free and only free and whatever you did, there was like no thing. I have to note for people listening, killing free like jumped revenue 20% and then it stayed at 20% high. Yeah. So it pushed it up 20% once and stayed there. So like there is something to the world when you're not a high growth VC backed company that you can do non-free.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I also think that sometimes like there's people, if something's free, they kind of discount it like from a quality perspective. Sometimes having also from an engagement perspective too, like if you paid for it, you're probably more likely to actually like use it.
Some investment on there.
Yeah, some investment, right? Yeah. So, and then if you're, running lean, you only really want to be able to pay attention to people who are like paying for it.
But that goes back to also like who you're selling to. So like if we knew that the buyer was not the developer, we never would have charged for that. But since it was the only thing to do. So yeah, anyway, it was a hard choice, but like it was like the obvious one where it's like there's nothing, whatever we did, there's nothing to do. And so basically at that point, I had got married and I did a 3-month around the world honeymoon. So yeah, that was, it's like contemplated.
Nice.
In terms of like adjusting your vision, I know you said you talked to analysts and you talked to like people that had done this at Uber and then also customers. Like, did you feel like analysts and people that had done it before were useful sources of advice in terms of like what people will pay for and that sort of stuff? Or was it really like, hey, we have to go to these end customers, potential purchasers themselves to get that good advice?
I think I did. I think the combination of all of them makes more sense because when you talk to analysts, like analysts have ideas which are their own, which they've structured, and sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. Yeah. And so what was interesting for me is like, oh, they gave me they were the ones that reached out originally and sort of kicked off the interest. The idea. But when you talk to someone, when you talk to the person, Sylvester at Slack, who runs their internal team, and when he says like, it's not mandatory in Slack to use our dev environment product, but 85% of developers use it every day. So then that's like, oh, okay, it's not just that they mandated it, so it might be, but like developers actually like the thing.
Yeah, they're making the choice, yeah.
So like if you have a company that's willing to invest, I forgot how big your team is, like 6, 10, 12 people, full time to build and manage this thing, and 80% that's not a small investment. Like what's the average salary of a developer in San Francisco?
Probably
200K all
plus,
in? Yeah, so you're talking like 1 to 2 million a year, at least every single year to pay for that, and 85% of your developers are using it. So I said, okay, this is somewhere where I feel we can fit in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, makes sense. All right, well, as we start to wrap up, we have some quick fire questions for you. So, all right, first one, if you could master one skill that you don't have right now, what would it be?
Master one skill, flying. Like an airplane.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, to be able to actually fly. Like maybe not a realistic skill. Yeah. What wastes the most time in your day?
What wastes emails, meetings, and my OCD to have like an inbox zero, which is a very hard thing for me in the sense of like trying to figure, oh, this is the thing I have to do today versus like, oh, here are all the things. And so I waste a lot of time on that.
Like clearing your inbox in. Yeah. If you could invest in one company that's not your own company, what would it be?
One company that's not my own. Like give me some constraints to that.
Well, I would say no public companies because it's like you can't invest in it. But like say like a private company that you're like pretty bullish on.
Yeah, I mean, this sounds like if I had to like risk my money, like the simplest one would be say like I'd invest in OpenAI right now. It just seems like silly that they're not going to expedite their value in the next couple of years. Yeah. So that seems like an easy one. Though.
Yeah. What tool or technology could you not live without?
Tool or technology? Superhuman, the email client.
Oh, yeah.
Which gets to my first.
Which person influenced you the most in your career?
Which person?
Which person influenced you the most in your career?
There's been a lot of people that have influenced me in my career. The most probably, he really recently passed away. He was my first sort of boss at the first job, the only job outside of Infobip that I actually had. So owner of a bunch of companies, basically taught, like the way he thought about business was very much led me into entrepreneurship.
And then 5 years from now, are we going to have more people writing code day to day or less?
I feel that historically, everything that we've done actually ends up bringing more work. And so I read an article once, and it even isn't true. So I read an article once that the only job ever that was displaced completely by technology was, do you know what it is? The only job ever.
I wasn't going to say completely, but like farming, has obviously gone down like a huge.
Yeah, but not completely. Callers. Yeah. But there's still technically people with callers.
So you know what it was in the article? So I can't remember what article it was elevator drivers or the people in the elevator. But that's not true. I was at a dinner party in New York the other day and there's like a
An elevator guy.
elevator manager, whatever it's called.
Yeah, if you take the Muni in San Francisco and you need to take the elevator, I was telling Alex this recently, I discovered this because if I go with my kids, and then I have a stroller and I need to take an elevator, and there's someone in there that logs all of it and they press the button for you and stuff. And I think part of it's like to make sure people aren't doing anything, drugs or alcohol. Like that.
I mean, there's different reasons, but I also was in, I don't know, in Dubai or Abu Dhabi, where it was, and there was people in like shopping mall elevators, but that's sort of to show off in that sense. But I mean, even that job is not done. I digress a bit, but I found that most jobs that technology displaces, there's just like so many more.
Yeah, they create net new jobs. Yeah.
And so even with like software development where we are, and this is like AI generating the code, I still think, and I think that's where we sort of play a part as well, is like you're gonna have AI creating a bunch of code, agents creating a bunch of code, but you're also gonna have to look at that, make sure that code makes sense, sort of commit a comment on that, or edit it, or change it, or send it back, and you have to be able to run that as well. And I think there's gonna be a lot more things generated, because now imagine that every single person can now start writing code in the sense of like, oh, I wanna do this product or project, can you go out and sort of build this thing for me? So I think there's gonna be more people in general, more higher skilled people that are doing that. And that's also another thing too, the way the market is going for anything, for like restaurants or laptops or food, is that you're going to have people on the one hand, which you're gonna have a lot of automation and be lower price, more accessible. But then you're gonna have the artisans on the other side, so highly skilled people, like best chef of the world, you're still gonna have awesome software engineers that can do things that other people don't. Like that's my general take on things, so yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, thanks so much for joining us. This was really fun.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Cheers.